Youngstown is the first Supreme Court case Chief Justice Roberts cited in his majority opinion in Trump versus United States, and he cited it in total 10 times, most of those cites to the Jackson concurrence. In opening the opinion, Roberts noted that, quote, "This case is the first criminal prosecution in our nation's history of a former president for actions taken during his presidency. We are called upon to consider whether and under what circumstances such a prosecution may proceed. We undertake that responsibility, conscious that we focus on," and here he's quoting Youngstown, "the enduring consequences upon the balanced power structure of our republic." But Roberts didn't simply take broad inspiration from Jackson and Youngstown. He suggested that Youngstown supported a finding of presidential immunity, including some absolute presidential immunity, through the novel three-part immunity framework that I referenced a little earlier. So in the first of the categories, in Roberts' three-part scheme, the president is absolutely immune when exercising core Article II powers. This category, says Roberts, flows directly from Youngstown, and in particular, Jackson's Zone 3. The Roberts opinion explained that in constitutional cases, the president's authority is sometimes, quote, conclusive and preclusive. So like he's got it, and it precludes anyone else from trying to regulate or check it. According to Roberts' gloss on Jackson, when the president exercises such authority, meaning this core Article II authority, he may act even when the measures he takes are incompatible with the expressed or implied will of Congress. The exclusive constitutional authority of the president, he says, disables the Congress from acting upon the subject. Once it is determined that the president acted within the scope of his exclusive authority, his discretion in exercising such authority cannot be subject to further judicial examination. So you might think from reading this Roberts passage that Jackson's opinion contained a full-throated endorsement of broad presidential powers beyond the reach of Congress to regulate or courts to examine. But the very passage Roberts is quoting snippets from, when read in its entirety, conveys an entirely different message. It says of this Zone 3, where the president acts contrary to congressional will, quote, I said already this, when the president takes these measures, contrary to the will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb. And then he continues, courts can sustain exclusive presidential control in such a case only by disabling the Congress from acting upon the subject. Presidential claim to a power at once so conclusive and preclusive must be scrutinized with caution, for what is at stake is the equilibrium established by our constitutional system. So rather than announce this conclusive and preclusive power, the passage is really warning about the danger. It is suggesting the paramount need for caution in recognizing it. It suggests that presidents may rarely act contrary to congressional discretion, and it certainly, congressional direction, and it certainly doesn't bless Truman's defiance of Congress in the seizure context. Roberts flips the valence of this passage entirely. Here's where else in his concurrence Jackson warned of the dangers of unchecked and concentrated executive power, in particular of the emergency powers the administration was claiming the president had the power to assert. Quote, "The example of such unlimited executive power that must have most impressed the forefathers was the prerogative exercised by George III, and the description of its evils in the Declaration of Independence leads me to doubt that they were creating their new executive in his image. Continental European examples were no more appealing, and if we seek instruction from our own times, we can match it only from the executive powers in those governments we disparagingly describe as totalitarian." Here's what else Jackson had to say. I cannot be brought to believe that this country will suffer if the court refuses to further to aggrandize the presidential office, already so potent and so relatively immune from judicial review. These aspects of Jackson's concurrence are not only absent from, but run directly contrary to Roberts' opinion. And that's, I think, made even clearer in the context of two examples that Roberts discusses, one involving the president's relationship with the Department of Justice and one involving presidential speech. I'll just briefly touch on both of them. So the majority suggests that the president's relationship with the Justice Department is in the category of presidential powers that Congress cannot regulate, including by exposing a former president to criminal liability under generally applicable laws if he violates those laws in his dealings with the Department of Justice. I think this is an exceedingly dangerous position. I can't imagine it's one Justice Jackson would have endorsed. According to Roberts, allegations that the former president tried to use DOJ to further a scheme to remain in office, quote, plainly implicate Trump's conclusive and preclusive authority, Roberts explains that's because investigative and prosecutorial decision-making is the special province of the executive branch, and the Constitution vests the entirety of the executive power in the president. So that means that we are in Roberts' first category, so, quote, Trump is absolutely immune from prosecution for the alleged conduct involving his discussions with Justice Department officials. Again, what this means is no matter how a president interacts with his subordinate officials at DOJ, or why, he can never be prosecuted under generally applicable laws, potentially, according to dissents by Justice Sotomayor and the current Justice Jackson, Ketanji Brown Jackson, by plotting a coup, directing subordinate officials to commit treason, perhaps even murdering them. Those all involve interactions with DOJ. This is in Ketanji Brown Jackson's opinion. And on the logic of the majority opinion, all of this would be immune. The relationship between the president and the Department of Justice is a complex one, as anyone who has ever served in the White House or the Department of Justice knows well. John Roberts knows this too. But to suggest that the court can eliminate all of that nuance and complexity in favor of an absolute presidential prerogative vis-a-vis DOJ and to claim it flows from Youngstown is, I think, madness. And in a part of the opinion I haven't yet mentioned, the court holds that even if a prosecutor manages to make out a case based on unofficial conduct, this kind of conduct within this category of absolute immunity can't even be introduced for its evidentiary value. No reference could be made to interactions with DOJ, even in, say, a bribery prosecution for unofficial conduct, because that's how powerful this absolute immunity is. One more example, presidential speech. So Roberts applies his framework to a couple of other aspects of Jack Smith's complaint, and the one I want to quickly talk about here is the aspects of the indictment that describe Trump's tweets encouraging supporters to travel to DC on January 6th, and then his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th. This kind of speech, Roberts explained, was not absolutely immune, like the dealings with DOJ, but was presumptively immune. So here's Roberts, quote, "The president possesses extraordinary power to speak to his fellow citizens. A long recognized aspect of presidential power is using the office's bully pulpit to persuade Americans. For these reasons, most of a president's public communications are likely to fall comfortably within the outer perimeter of his official responsibilities." Now, I think it's clearly right that for over a century, presidents have used the bully pulpit to augment the formal powers of the presidency. For Roberts, that's a reason to give presidential speech at least presumptive immunity from criminal prosecution, no matter how dangerous or destructive the speech. But here's what Jackson had to say in language that is shockingly relevant even 70 years later. Quote, "Executive power has the advantage of concentration in a single head, in whose choice the whole nation has a part, making him the focus of public hopes and expectations. In drama, magnitude, and finality, his decisions so far overshadow any others that almost alone he fills the public eye and ear. No other personality in public life can begin to compete with him in access to the public mind through modern methods of communication. By his prestige as head of state and his influence upon public opinion, he exerts a leverage upon those who are supposed to check and balance his power, which often cancels their effectiveness." So to Jackson, the fact of the president's access to communication channels, to the bully pulpit, was reason to constrain executive power. Roberts, in his immunity decision, turns that logic on its head, suggesting that the president's rhetorical primacy is a reason to insulate the president from sanction for illegal acts that may involve speech. Roberts ends his immunity decision by invoking the separation of powers. Quote, "The system of separated powers designed by the framers has always demanded an energetic, independent executive. But by eliminating an important set of checks on the president, the opinion subverts the separation of powers. The opinion purports to rely on Jackson's Youngstown concurrence, but it fundamentally betrays it.